Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. It's good to see you back. I'm Ramjee Chandran and I welcome you to episode 76 of season 2. In the last episode, I left you on the battlefield at Talikota. The fighting had ended abruptly when Ali Ramaraya was captured and executed, beheaded by the man whose head he had asked for, Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. The Sultanate coalition had prevailed, and the glory of Vijayanagara had ended in a single afternoon. What followed was a degradation of Vijayanagara from one of the greatest cities in the world to one that had been completely forgotten until it was rediscovered 250 years later. That is the story you'll hear today. But not before I get the chance to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group. Their support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. War is not pretty. It is the most gruesome act of man. Warriors are rarely heroes. They are poor, common farm folk, peaceful men who till the soil and return to their families in the evening, until the day that they are called upon in the name of God and country to die for another man's glory. While tales of history often celebrate victory in war, the aftermath of battle was not a place for someone weak of stomach. The first thing that hits you is the smell. It's overpowering. Bodies decomposing in the intense Deccan heat, mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, and the metallic tang of blood everywhere. The ground is just churned up mud mixed with blood and torn earth from all the fighting. A scene of extreme and bloody violence perpetrated by men who had no time to think. In a second, they would have to kill or be killed. Bodies scattered as far as you can see. Soldiers in their different uniforms and armor. Some still clutching weapons, others twisted in their final moments. War elephants lying dead like small hills, some with arrows still stuck to their sides. Thousands of men blown to bits from cannon fire at point-blank range. Broken weapons everywhere, shattered spears, bent swords, shields trampled into the mud. Banners and flags that used to mark different regiments are now just torn cloth on the ground. Now, if sights were not bad enough, there were the sounds. It was not the eerie silence that was unsettling. Right now, silence would have been welcome. Instead, what you heard were the faint cries of men who had not yet died, but were going to very soon. Maybe you'll hear the groaning of injured horses or elephants trumpeting their last. Wounded men pointlessly calling out for water or for help. Vultures and crows circling overhead, making harsh calls, landing to feed, from people who may not even be dead yet. Jackals and other wild animals overcoming their fear of men, picking their way through the bodies, making their way to the bounty of carrion. And then the constant low buzz of the swarm of flies, thousands upon thousands of them. Through all this carnage, the sounds of other men, the survivors, the victorious, and the onlookers, no longer at war but picking from the dead, their voices carrying as they strip armor from the fallen, arguing over spoils, the clank of metal as they gather up weapons and valuables. Men forcing open the mouths of fallen aristocrats, looking to gouge gold teeth from them. It's hot, it's inhumane and deeply unsettling. A place where you can viscerally feel that something monumental and terrible has just happened. In a few hours, everyone who hadn't died yet would die, their carrion picked clean. And only then, the fearful finality of eerie silence. Ernest Hemingway once wrote in his dispatches from the front lines, "No catalogue of horrors ever kept men from war." Truly, the Sultanate forces were prepared to take the horror into the capital, Vijayanagara. The objective of the Sultanate was clear. The Battle of Talikota had been fought because the Sultanates could no longer tolerate Ali Ramaraya's Vijayanagara. No matter what their internal strife was, they could not let this happen again. Therefore, defeating Vijayanagara in one battle did not solve the issue. They needed to erase Vijayanagara from the map so it could no longer pose a threat. And the way to do that was to physically erase it from the map. In the medieval Deccan, the Kannada phrase ooru alivu meant exactly the same thing. erased the town. It was a long-standing tactic where the attack on a settlement would be followed by the sacking and the burning of the village. There is the hero stone that talks about the Rashtrakuta attack on the Ganga-controlled Hebal in the 8th century, and the phrase used there was the same. What the Bijapur Sultanate wanted on behalf of all the sultanates was the ooru alivu of Vijayanagara. And to that end, the battle was not done, and the army would march into Vijayanagara. When the beheading of Aliyarama abruptly ended the battle of Rakasagi-Tangadgi, his brothers Tirumala and Venkatadri, who had commanded 2 of the 3 divisions of the army, fled the battlefield. Well, actually, there is no record of what happened to Venkatadri, whether he lived or died in battle, but we do know that Tirumala made his way quickly back to Vijayanagara. Tirumala's objective was the continuity of the empire, or whatever was left of it. But knowing the sack of the city was soon to follow, and knowing that he would not be in a position to defeat the Sultanate forces, he prepared to vacate the capital. We might remember at this point that the king of Vijayanagara was not Aliyarama, but the unfortunate Sadashiva, who had only lived his life under custody, so that Aliyarama could rule as the de facto king. In what seemed to be a well-planned departure, the Vijayanagara royals gathered all their riches and left their land forever. The women of the royal household were gathered together first. Then treasury officials loaded as many as 1,550 elephants, pack mules, and bullock carts with gold and jewels. This treasury under movement included anything portable from the palace and state-owned stores and warehouses. Later European estimates of that wealth removed by Tirumala was more than 100 million pounds sterling. The royal court left Vijayanagara along the road to Penukonda, and with their departure, the city had lost its last center of authority and fell to chaos and to anarchy. Although the royal family managed to save the state insignia and the celebrated jewel throne, they left the once glorious city of Vijayanagara and abandoned its inhabitants to be systematically looted and destroyed. Back in the scene of the battle, the camps housing the Sultanate armies would have stretched for many kilometers, from the fields between Rakasagi and Tangadgi to the fields south of the river Krishna, right through to Banihatti. But the battle was done, and the Sultanates had now to work out what would happen now that they had jointly defeated Vijayanagara. Berar had not joined the coalition, but the other 4 Sultanates, members of the so-called League of the Faithful, needed an arrangement. What transpired was a partition agreement between the 2 largest members of the coalition, Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur and Hussain Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. They had been sworn enemies before they reconciled to fight Vijayanagara jointly, and despite a marriage alliance between the families and every other effort at unity, they were pragmatic enough to realize that they needed a mature agreement to prevent a fracture of their future relationship. And to this end, the 2 sultans agreed to a free hand policy. Nizam Shah promised not to interfere with Bijapur's attempt to annex Vijayanagara territories, and in exchange, Ali Adil Shah agreed to leave Nizam Shah free to conquer Berar. This deal was essentially a bilateral pact, and the Sultan of Golconda was excluded from all discussions. Not surprisingly, this would be the end of their relationship. For 3 days after the battle, the Bijapur army rested in place, getting their second wind. Detailed plans would have been drawn up in this time for the sack of Vijayanagara to follow. Many army units, likely all the heavy artillery, considering there was never going to be an army to oppose them or a fort to siege, would have been sent back to Bijapur and a strike force assembled for the Vijayanagara campaign. 3 days passed and the march began. The day was Jan 26th, 1565. When I come back from this 30-second commercial break, the sack of Vijayanagara, right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
The first sack of Vijayanagara was not from the Sultanate forces. It came from tribes that lived around the city. Between the day of the royal flight, which was roughly 24th of January, and the arrival of the Sultanate, likely around 27th of January, this defenseless and forsaken metropolis became prey to local robber tribes and jungle people, specifically the accounts say tribes like the Lambadas and the Crowbars. These groups launched at least 6 concerted attacks on a single day as markets and storehouses were broken open and looted in rapid succession. Shops were stripped, warehouses were emptied. The remaining inhabitants buried their valuables in courtyards, wells, and fields anywhere they could. For a very long time, rumor has had it that there is a vast amount of wealth in the earth under the present-day Hampi, and that rumor recently gained momentum when, just a few days ago, gold jewelry was found buried in the village of Lakundi, less than 100 kilometers from Hampi. Back then, by the time the Sultanate armies entered the city, Vijayanagara had already suffered its first unrestrained violence. The arrival of the Sultanate forces marked a completely different phase. What followed then was not disorder, but organized destruction. That sack began in late January, unfolded over nearly 6 months, and proceeded with method and persistence. The city was not simply looted and abandoned, it was taken apart. Fire, crowbars, and axes were used systematically. Buildings were stripped before they were destroyed. Doors, beams, and fittings were removed. Stone structures were attacked where they carried symbolic or administrative meaning. Massive fires were set, hot enough to crack the stone basements of palace complexes. The heat damage is visible in the ruins today, and that belonged to this particular phase. Large stone shrines were dismantled, some of them were mutilated, sculptures were defaced, the colossal Narasimha monolith was left fractured. The material markers of Vijayanagara's sovereignty were targeted and neutralized through repeated action over many months. The scale of plunder was unprecedented. Even after the royal court had departed with a treasury of £100 million sterling, the wealth removed by the Sultanate armies remained immense. Again, contemporary accounts report that ordinary soldiers had become rich in gold and jewels. Ali Adil Shah personally claimed a diamond described as being the size of a hen's egg. This was not the extraction of a defeated city for tribute, it was the dismantling of a capital. By the middle of 1565, it is said that large sections of Vijayanagara had been rendered uninhabitable. The population had thinned drastically. Those who remained lived among ruins, moving cautiously through a city whose roads no longer afforded safety. But the countryside surrounding the capital was worse. It had fallen under the control of armed bandits, making leaving the city as dangerous as staying there. In 1567, the Venetian traveller Cesare Federici reached the site. Why is not very clear. His account is one of the clearest descriptions of what remained. He reported that the city stood empty. Many houses were still standing and had not been entirely destroyed, but they were uninhabited. Federici himself was detained in these ruins for 7 months. He was unable to leave because of the surrounding roads that were infested with brigands. His experience confirmed what Tirumala had already understood. Authority had collapsed so completely that even movement had become impossible without force. Federici noted that wild animals had started roaming the abandoned portions of the city. Tigers, he wrote, now occupied spaces that had once held markets, workshops, and homes. The image marked a watershed. Vijayanagara had ceased to function as a human settlement of scale. Yet amid all this destruction, one structure still stood, and this was the Virupaksha temple. While other massive stone temples were dismantled or damaged, the Virupaksha temple escaped systematic destruction. When Colin Mackenzie, the British surveyor, surveyed the ruins 2.5 centuries later in 1800, he found the temple stood almost untouched. The reason for this survival is not explained in contemporary records. No decree preserves it, and there's no account that describes it as a deliberate exemption. The truth is we don't know. After the city had been abandoned by the elite, the Virupaksha temple continued to function as a living religious establishment through all of these years. What can be said is limited to this evidence. Every other major structure was gone. The city showed signs of deliberate destruction, but the Virupaksha temple does not. Its survival remains an anomaly within an otherwise consistent pattern of axial destruction. The reason? No one knows. By the end of 1565, the sack had achieved its purpose. Vijayanagara no longer functioned as a capital or functioned in any other way. No authority returned to restore it. No garrison was left to govern it. The Sultanate coalition itself had fractured, with all its members turning back towards their own rivalries and their own conquests, and the city was left behind. What remained was not a fallen civilization, not a romantic ruin, but an emptied shell, a place where power and glory had once concentrated, and from which it had now withdrawn completely. That absence would influence the politics of Deccan for decades to come. While the alivu of Bijapur may well have been very successful for the time, the one thing that they could not erase was the memory of Vijayanagara. When the sack was done, there was no one left in Vijayanagara. The royal family had moved to Penukonda. The sultanates were back bickering amongst themselves in Bijapur. The League of the Faithful lacked a cohesive principle beyond that common dread of Vijayanagara. But once that was gone, and once that city was reduced to ruins, mutual jealousies caused the confederacy to dissolve. Ali Adil Shah immediately began seizing frontier districts to the north. Meanwhile, the Qutub Shahs of Golconda, who had been ignored in the discussions, launched their own campaigns, and they eventually captured Rajahmundry in 1571 and 72. And by late 1565, the Sultans of Bijapur and Ahmednagar were again engaged in a fresh war against one another. Taking advantage of this distraction, Tirumala tried to return to Vijayanagara and tried to repopulate it in 1566. But the threat of retaliation from Bijapur put paid to all those plans, and Tirumala hastily withdrew. The sack and plunder of Vijayanagara is a lesson in human avarice. The tribes that had attacked Vijayanagara and tried to plunder never really stopped. Such was their terror that it took specific action by a Sultanate general, Mustafa Khan, to secure the camp from these brigands who used to show up in the dead of night and stab soldiers to death in their sleep. In time, it would come to pass that they actually had been supported by local palegars, or at least local toughs and petty power bases in the area, and over time they became a force, dangerous in their own fragmented state of affairs. When Vijayanagara fell, it was each man to himself, with every robber, looter, and other flavor of opportunist seeking to plunder what they could do for themselves. And what we think of Vijayanagara and the devotion of its subjects was probably the greatest myth of all. And when Colin Mackenzie revealed to the modern world the astonishing city of Vijayanagara, it had been covered by a dense overgrowth. Tigers and other wild animals roamed its streets and ruins freely. Nothing existed in a complete form, but for that one solitary Virupaksha temple. In the next episode, we return to Bangalore and how it functioned in the aftermath of Vijayanagara, and to the last of Kempegowda's reign, and how the loss of Vijayanagara was the dawn of the history of Mysore and Bangalore. That is coming up very soon. Thank you for listening. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.